Okay, I see people starting to come in right now. We'll wait about 30 seconds and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get rolling here. So welcome everybody to the Direct Sourcing Forum. This is our spring webinar. Great to see so many people out there again. I do want to extend a special welcome to our international guests joining us today from Canada, Great Britain, India, Lithuania, Mexico, Panama, the Netherlands, the United Arab Emirates, and South Africa. Welcome to all of you. For those who haven't been here with us before, we created this forum to provide a stage and a spotlight for direct sourcing. Our mission is to examine emerging trends and best practices and do it in a way that collectively benefits the whole industry. So hopefully you'll notice that we avoid being salesy and we try always to be informational. Today we have a specific topic in mind: how to select a direct sourcing provider. So we're going to discuss that for the next hour. Before we get started, let me mention just a housekeeping item. We are going to be recording the webinar today, and that includes chat. So please don't write anything that you wouldn't say in front of your children or repeat in public. And then finally, before we get started, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. Karen, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you all for joining. My name is Karen Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Vice President for LiveHire, which basically means I manage the North American business. I've been with LiveHire now for a little over 2 years. Have really spent my entire career in this workforce solution space. So really happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. John, do you want to go?
Sure, happy to. Thank you for having me, first off. John Dolman, I'm with TalentNet. I'm a Director of Business Development and Client Engagement. I'm new to the panel here, although TalentNet's been a part of it throughout the series. And so I'm excited to be speaking with you guys today. I've been with TalentNet for about a year, almost a year and a half. Prior to that, I came from one of the larger MSPs in the industry. But unlike most of the panelists on here, the vast majority of my career was actually in the medical space. And so I'm a relative newbie to the old talent acquisition space, having been in this role and others for about 4 or 5 years. And so excited to be part of this panel and happy to be talking with everybody today. Thanks
for being with us, John. Praneeth?
Thanks, Brian, for hosting another amazing session. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Praneeth Patlola. I am the SVP of Direct Sourcing here at Pro Unlimited. Prior to this, I was with WillHire, which was acquired by Pro Unlimited. Pro Unlimited, as you know, is the global MSP, VMS, direct sourcing provider. And my role is to venture the direct sourcing into the market, as I've been doing that for quite some time. My background is in engineering. HR tech journey is where I live and breathe. This is my 3rd company in the same space. Thank you.
Welcome, Praneeth. Thank you. Coop, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Brian, thank you. To my co-panelists, thank you as well. To all of our attendees, thank you for joining us today. My name is David Cooper. I'm the president of Opley. We're a direct sourcing technology platform, and we've been in this space for over 5 years. I myself, like Karen, have been in this space for over 30 years on the talent acquisition and technology side. So thank you today.
Thanks for being with us, Coop.
Sure.
My name is Brian Mcguire. I lead sales at Talent Belt. We provide direct sourcing advisory services to customers who are looking for help creating a business case, or with solution design or vendor selection or program optimization. So happy to be here with our panelists today. And let's go ahead and get started. Our first question today is for Karen. Karen, the question is this: do I need to launch an RFP to evaluate providers?
Great question. And I think the short answer is not necessarily. I think if you were to ask any of us, we would say no, because I think there's a much more efficient way to evaluate curation and technology partners when you're looking at implementing direct sourcing. I recognize that some companies will require some type of RFP process. I think some things to think about is, direct sourcing is still an emerging solution that is still in the early adoption phase. So it might be really difficult for people in HR or procurement to know what questions to ask or to include in an RFP process, because they don't have a lot of history with direct sourcing. So do you have somebody that understands the technical aspects of direct sourcing and what questions to ask from a curation standpoint? I think the other thing to consider is there's really just a small number of both curation partners and technology partners that do direct sourcing. So what we've seen work really well is what people would call an agile RFP process. And they may ask a few questions, but they really meet with the individual providers, let those providers present their solution. And then from there, down select the finalists, maybe ask some more questions, maybe do some solutioning before they select their final provider. But I think that from a timeline perspective, it's a much shorter timeline. It's less work for the organization, and it tends to be a much more efficient process, just given that there aren't a lot of players in this space right now. So that, direct sourcing partners compared to MSP or VMS or staffing providers looks a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of, if you are going to go through an RFP process, I would just say, do your research, talk to people in the industry, talk to analysts, talk to various curation and technology providers to see who they recommend. I would say you want to evaluate direct sourcing separately from any other solution. So if you're looking for an MSP or a VMS at the same time, just like you evaluate those solutions separately, I would say evaluate direct sourcing separately. You know your organization better than anybody else, and it's worth evaluating independently from other solutions that you may be looking to implement. I think if you have an MSP in place, it's certainly good to understand who they've worked with, what their recommendations are. But even in that case, I would say run it independently, but keep your MSP and your VMS aware of the process and what you're doing. I think you also need to determine whether you're going to evaluate technology companies and curation companies together, separately. What does that look like? And do you want a private talent community, or do you want a marketplace? Do you have the internal buy-in that you need from stakeholders to move forward with any type of RFP process? And do you understand the best practices and what's required and recommended to ensure that your direct sourcing program is successful? And I would say, if you're not sure what questions to ask, or you find yourself struggling to understand, like, what questions do I need to ask potential partners, whether it's in a written format or in a meeting, you can engage somebody like Brian at Talent Belt to help formulate those questions, run the RFP process. I know we've probably all, sorry about that. I know we've all probably helped different clients with, providing questions for an RFP. I think if you're going to do that, just make sure the questions come from multiple sources so that you avoid any kind of bias.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
I would definitely agree with everything Karen said. Certainly, if your organization requires an RFP from a procurement practice, certainly do some of that from a Q&A perspective. But we have found a lot of really good dialogue and collaboration with some of the recent engagements that we have personally had, and probably my co-panelists have had, in going through use case scenarios, mm-hmm. right? Identifying what are you exactly trying to accomplish. And how do these technology and partnership with Curation and EOR solve for those challenges? So it's really, it's certainly early days for some of the companies that are looking for these solutions, and understanding where they fit, what you're trying to accomplish, I think is really well articulated in use case and solution design and actual solution architecture discussions.
Mm-hmm. And Karen, quick follow-up. How long does an Agile RFP typically take versus a traditional RFP?
Again, I feel like, I don't know if there is a typical, right? I think that timeline depends on your ability to engage the right stakeholders, get approvals, but it will definitely be less than what it would normally be. So I've seen Agile RFPs take as little as a week to 2 weeks, depending on how fast you can meet, how much research you've done ahead of time, to 4 to 5 weeks, depending on the stakeholder approvals that are needed once the decision's made.
Okay, good to know. Coop's off screen. We'll give him a second. We have a question for you here.
Yep.
How should I determine which providers I should invite or evaluate?
Yep. No, it's a great question. There are not a lot of us in the space, so the good news is you're starting to see, I think, some segmentation of, where one provider, may fit into a particular use case versus another provider fitting into an alternative use case. But if you think of it, it's much like you're doing anything in life, right? If I'm going to go on a journey, is that journey a walk? Is it a bike ride? Is it a run? Is it a car? Is it a plane, right? I think you have to figure out, what are we trying to accomplish? And determining what you're trying to accomplish, what are your value drivers, right? What's the desired outcome you're aiming for? Because there are differing value drivers associated to direct sourcing. Some folks are very oriented towards, we need broader access to talent. We need to intervene into innovation into our talent strategy. We want to leverage our brand. We want to have cost savings. We want to do all the above, right? I think first you have to identify, what is the desired outcome? What are the goals of that outcome? Because I think that one starts to, I think, segment which providers you would invite into a selection process, whether it be full-blown RFP, solution workshop that we all just covered on the prior question. Another thing to look at is the scope of your direct sourcing initiative from a worker type perspective. Are you looking at FTE full-time hires? Are you looking at contingent workers? Are you looking at a blend? Again, that starts to give some kind of segmentation amongst the providers. Additionally, looking at skill sets. Are you predominantly focusing this on blue collar? Are you focusing on white collar? Because I think some of the technology functionality could be oriented towards one of those segmentations or another. Another thing to look at is, from a focus alignment, are you looking at deploying a public marketplace, where you're going to bring talent in outside of your brand? That provides, a different provider segmentation. Are you looking to do a public marketplace as well as private? So that starts to help understand what type of people do we want to attract. Is it just people known to us, known to our brand, tied to our brand? Is it also, bringing people in that, are more in an open marketplace? A couple of things to look at from an AI engagement, looking at how critical is artificial intelligence embedded within direct sourcing technologies to your desired outcome. And when you're looking at the candidate experience, are you looking for, ATS CRM kind of functionality that attracts talent, and or are you looking for that exact experience that also encapsulates AI, to identify and opt in and engage, a highly matched, highly engaged workforce. And then lastly, thinking of your curation strategy. What are the thoughts around how these technology providers, all of us on the panel here, partner with curation providers? What is that human engagement in curation? And when you speak of curation, there are some that look at curation and say, that's really candidate filtering. There are others that say it's human to human engagement. And then lastly is looking at the employer of record strategy. So a lot said, but it's kind of that big, right? When you started looking back at deploying a VMS, a lot of different attributes came to mind, but they were numerous and they provided segmentation. I think the exact same thing exists within the direct sourcing tech vertical.
Mm-hmm. No, great answer. A lot of detail. And I think circling back to earlier questions, it sounds like, in summary, there's a relatively small number of providers, so it probably makes sense to give everybody an opportunity for a conversation in the context of, we talked about an Agile RFP. So, I could see that there's some circumstances where you would simply not include somebody because they're just not a good fit, but otherwise, we're still at a point in the industry where it's relatively easy to give everybody their 15 minutes of fame so you can figure out, who is best to move forward with. So at least that's what I'm hearing. So I appreciate the detail, Coop.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
We've got a question that came up a few minutes ago. John, this is for you. What internal stakeholders should be included in the evaluation process?
Yeah, great question. And Coop and Karen have touched a little bit on this as well in their answers. And so I'll do my best not to repeat those, but as I think about the kind of key constituents within an organization and who should be involved, there may be a bit of overlap from some of the answers you heard a moment ago. But I think this is definitely an important topic as a client for you to consider as you go down this path, right? And so the first one, and probably the obvious, and I'm going to name some groups, and then I'll try to give a bit more detail around each of those. I think the most obvious would be like talent acquisition, HR, and procurement, right? Because this is a talent strategy. And whether it's contingent focused and then heavily led by procurement, or whether it's more full-time or freelancer focused and maybe led more by talent acquisition or HR, I think that's probably where most of the conversation starts, right? So I would certainly be thinking about those internal stakeholders within your organization in those three key areas. After that, and the next ones are not necessarily in a particular order, so I'll just go through them, but it doesn't mean that I've prioritized one over the other. Legal compliance and information security. And so you're going to hear me talk a fair amount about that today, but legal compliance, information security are probably going to be three constituents that you want to address. You're dealing with a lot of information, a lot of personal candidate information. And so as you're thinking about your program and how that's going to interact with your business, you're going to want to incorporate them into the decision process. Next would be brand and marketing. So similar to the previous answer where I talked about legal compliance infosec, there's a heavy interaction and interplay between your brand and your marketing team, assuming you want to have a branded program, right? So I think, and I think all four of us would say that's definitely the direction you should be leaning. There's few examples of non-branded direct sourcing programs, but the vast majority of successful programs are going to be branded. So in that case, you're going to want to incorporate your brand and marketing teams into the discussion and decision process. And any four of us, if you worked with any four of us, we're going to work with them as we go through configuration implementation to pull in things like the correct use of logos, colorways, images, and likeness, et cetera. And so they're going to need to be a part of that process. Next would be some kind of an executive sponsor, likely outside of, say, talent acquisition, HR, and procurement. One of the key factors to success in a direct sourcing program is adoption. And so having somebody, whether that maybe is a CHRO or even somebody from the business that's a key sponsor that can really evangelize these decisions and strategies that you've embarked on, I think is really critical to success. So if you could find a really dynamic leader from maybe the business that could talk about the success of a direct sourcing program or what it could mean to their business, I think that would be really critical. And so you want to incorporate them into that process as well. And then the last one I'll speak to, I think, would be finance or some sort of a financial component. Most direct sourcing programs yield significant savings and have a significant impact on the bottom line. And so they're probably going to want to play a part in this discussion. I won't mention specific client names, but we had a client recently that in their first year of going live saved $21 million versus competitively sourced candidates. And so you can imagine finance is going to want to be involved and informed of those kind of decisions that could have that kind of an impact on a bottom line. Mm-hmm. So I've named a lot right there, 4 or 5 major groups, but then some subgroups within that. But I think those are the key stakeholders that I would be looking at if I were in your shoes.
Great answer, John. Quick follow-up question. Who among those stakeholder groups typically leads the initiative as a champion?
Yeah, I would say I'll go back to that first group of either talent acquisition or procurement, depending on really the focus and the scope of the program. So again, if it's largely contingent labor focused, it's probably procurement that's really leading the effort. If it's more of a total talent management or full-time effort, then it's probably talent acquisition and HR. But I would say it starts in either one of those two areas, is so far in my experience.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate it. We've got a question for Praneeth. Should I involve my current MSP and or suppliers in an evaluation?
That's a tough question for me personally at this stage, but I'll try to be as neutral as I can. So
I hadn't thought of that. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, buddy.
So I'll start with suppliers. So the bigger question is, why do you need to involve suppliers in evaluations or not? Personally, there is much to less value unless you have specialized suppliers who are niched out and understanding some space and has been very critical for your organization. taking their inputs in how to evaluate the delivery process probably, or traction process, and setting up your program probably will help you. But if you have your talent acquisition team who has much more hands-on your branding, your traction management enablement, that team is much more better focused or more viable to the evaluation process than an external suppliers. Or and it will be very hard for you to determine whom to involve in that evaluation process unless you want them to participate as to address any of your DS program needs as an extension along with the technology to source candidates part of the supply pool. MSP's involvement, I think there is a mixed reviews around that, whether MSP should be involved in this decision-making process. Will it be biased about, because many a times you'll see MSP providers also come up with their existing solutions or recommendations. But as from an evaluation process of which provider from technology do you want to involve, which EOR provider is suitable for this, which curation partner is suitable for this, or do you also want to bring in an RPO style model into this program of DS? That whole depends on the organization structure and what relationship you have with your MSP, and have you already made a decision to make sure they are neutral, they don't have any say around it. Then you actually could take advice, but I would not make decisions out of it. I would recommend taking advice on each part of it. And if your MSP is knowing your program better, they probably will have recommendations around these providers or these technologies or these curation providers or EORs are better suitable. That's a great input within the evaluation process, but I will not put them in the panel of evaluators.
Okay, that's a very good answer. You did a great job being diplomatic there too. Does anybody have anything that they would want to add to what Praneeth just said? Any thoughts about involving MSP and suppliers?
I think there's a distinction between involving suppliers in the evaluation process versus being transparent about what you're going to be doing around direct sourcing. So I think there's a distinction there. Most clients that I've talked to that have implemented direct sourcing believe in being transparent with the suppliers, like this is what we're looking to do. There may be some optimization that's going to occur versus, all of a sudden they're just, they find out from somebody else or they are optimized out of the program and they don't know why. So I think transparency is something that I would personally recommend. It's how we do business. But I think it just, you have to make that decision as an organization about how to approach that.
Great point. And just to add to that, and I think Karen made a great point, when how your suppliers get impacted with direct sourcing is obviously the elephant in the room when you're bringing a new initiative under direct sourcing. And several organizations have gone through this journey and having those conversations early on and mitigating and segmenting a part of business to ensure it's not tier zeroed out for any disadvantage to the suppliers, or negotiating where is their highest value for the niche services they provide so that they get enough of what they need from the business to do business with the organization.
Yeah.
Great commentary. I appreciate that. We have a question for Karen. What are the typical steps and timeline for an evaluation? And I know, given that we just talked about Agile RFPs and traditional, maybe touch on both. Are there common threads between them that need to be sort of cared for?
Yeah, and again, I don't know if we know that there's a typical yet, but I think at the very least, you need to know who the top providers are for both curation and technology. As I mentioned before, do your research, talk to your MSP, talk to the VMS, talk to analysts, talk to other people that have implemented a direct sourcing program, so that you really get buy-in from different perspectives, not buy-in, but you get different perspectives from a direct sourcing perspective. I think it's important to ask the technology companies who they recommend from a curation standpoint and vice versa. I think that it's important to ask each potential partner to present their solution to your various stakeholders so that they have an understanding of the differentiators, what's different between the different technology and curation partners. I also think, when you have a technology company or a curation partner presenting, it's really important that the entire solution is presented so that your stakeholders understand how the puzzle pieces fit together. So if we're presenting to a client, we don't just go in and present the technology, we present the entire solution. So you want to know about the technology and the curation independently, but you also need to understand how the EOR, the curation team, and the technology fit together to provide that holistic solution to your organization. And I think then from there, you can down select your finalists. I always recommend kind of a deeper dive solutioning session to make sure that you understand exactly, how this is going to be implemented, what's going to be involved from your standpoint, what are the roles and responsibilities between the parties, who's going to be your central point of contact, and really determine your organizational readiness. Because I think, again, because this is a new solution, there are some things that you need to consider to make sure that you're actually ready to implement a direct sourcing strategy. And then check your references, and not only client references, but again, check references from technology companies that the curation partner is partnered with, and check references with the curation partners, check references on both sides. So check technology references, curation references, so that you understand what each is saying about the other and who they recommend, because it's really important that the curation partner feels good about the technology that's selected and vice versa. And then finally, then you're ready to select your partner. And I think this goes back to that more agile process. If you need to conduct an RFP, do it, but I don't think it needs to be overcomplicated. I think in terms of timeline, I think the things that really impact timeline is really your ability to gather the information that you need, and how quickly can you do that? How quickly can you evaluate the information that you receive? How quickly can you get things approved internally and get that stakeholder buy-in that we've been talking about? And then how quickly can you make those decisions? I've seen some companies kind of get into that analysis paralysis where they're talking to so many people, and then it starts to get confusing, and they just keep going round and round and round because it's hard to kind of pull the trigger and make the final decision. So you don't want to get into that kind of tailspin, if you will. But I think if you have this kind of process in place, you can make a decision. You should be able to make a decision certainly within a few weeks, but I've seen these decisions go longer than 6 months because of that analysis paralysis that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. We understand there's some complexities too. If there are, complex integrations or things of that nature that extend that timeline, that can certainly happen. But most of the time, this can be done much quicker than, for example, an MSP or a VMS implementation.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great commentary. And I would echo what you're saying. I don't want to repeat it because I know we have rules about repeating things that have already been said. But yeah, I would say a lot of folks are seeing a tendency now to sort of repeat the MSP VMS paradigm, and the RFPs in general are getting a little bit lengthy and complex. And I think what I'm hearing is that direct sourcing can almost be like adding a supplier to a program. You don't need to do the level of analysis and planning that are typical of MSP and VMS. So I think that's a key takeaway.
Brian, probably a point to put on that, just super quick, is while you're going through this evaluation process, leverage what you've already done, right? If you're on the contingent side of the house, and understand your VMS workflow, and understand how through APIs you plug these direct sourcing technology solutions into that existing framework. Mm-hmm. And it's the exact same thing on the FTE side, right? You have ATS, you have CRM systems already live within your environment. Look at the API integrations between those techs, and leverage some of the work you've already done. Sure. To both your and Karen's point, to make it a much easier lift, and not as such a intrusive implementation or thought design you may have with rolling out an ERP technology. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add that the heavy lifting is really done. If you have an MSP, it's the MSP and your direct sourcing partners, the EOR, the curation partner, and the technology. That's where most of the heavy lifting occurs. There will be support needed, as we've talked about, from various stakeholders, certainly through implementation and ongoing sponsorship. But it doesn't involve a huge amount of resources long-term on the client side. So that's something else to keep in mind as well.
Mm-hmm.
Could I,
John,
Brian, real quick before you move on, I just want to highlight something Karen said or suggested early on in that answer, and there's been a lot of really good information, but I want to go back to it just to make sure everybody kind of heard it and puts it in the back of their mind around ask your curation or your potential curation partners or people that are out the industry. You can ask them for questions that you as a client should be asking us, the technology provider, and vice versa. These curation partners use our platforms every single day, and I'm sure all four of us would be more than happy to provide you with, say, the top 10 questions you should be asking a curator. And you're probably going to see a lot of overlap between our organizations, but I think we've already done a lot of that work for you. We've already had a lot of these experiences. And so we're happy to support you through, here's some RFP questions that you should consider. But I strongly recommend you do that from both directions, right? Ask curators what they should be asking of technology, and ask technology providers what you should be asking of curators. And I think you'll come to, together with a really nice set of questions.
Yeah, great commentary. Appreciate it, John. John, next question is for you. So you're going to stay active here. We've touched on this, I think, a little bit already, but John, I'd like to see you unpack this in a little more detail. What key criteria should be used to evaluate providers? Specifically, what should be looked for, and should it be weighted?
Yeah, this is kind of a meaty question, so I'll rely on the rest of the panels to keep me honest here if I miss something as well. So I encourage you guys to speak up if I gloss over something. I'll start with maybe the second part of that question, which I think is a little bit easier. Should it be weighted? I think the simple answer is it'll probably naturally be weighted, but how it's weighted, I think, will vary depending on you, the client, and your own needs, right? So what I'm about to kind of unpack for you, is not in a particular order. So I don't want you to read any implied weighting to this, because I think it'll vary probably significantly depending on your organizational makeup, the objectives of your program, the scope, meaning geography, is it global, is it not? So just kind of think of, this will be sort of unique to each of you as you hear this. One that I've already touched on that I said I would be spending a fair amount of time talking about today is data privacy and information security, what I'll call capabilities and certifications or credentials, right? I'm going to come back and have a lot of detail around kind of data privacy risk and security measures and things like that later. So I'm just going to call it out as kind of a heading at the moment. I think that that's something that you should be considering in your selection process. It is a technology after all, so it's important that you think about those capabilities and certifications. Next would be, and Karen mentioned this earlier, like a representative and a referenceable client install base, right? So the first part, representative, meaning do they have clients that look like me? So as I'm evaluating providers out there, it would probably be helpful if they had some clients that were of similar industry, size, geographies, complexity, et cetera, so that I could understand how they've managed those programs, best practices that maybe I could glean from some of these early adopters. And so I think a representative client install base is really helpful, but then also a referenceable client base, right? Karen mentioned, talk to some of their current clients, talk to people who've interacted with them. So I think that's something you should definitely be considering. If you're talking to a platform out there, which is not the case with any of the four of us, that's not able to give you a reference, that should be a red flag. Next would be, and I think this has been mentioned a couple times, I would say public versus private talent pool philosophy, right? So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer, and in some cases you may combine the two of those. But I think understanding what are your goals and objectives of your program, and then what does that mean in terms of a public versus a private talent pool philosophy? And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If you have a really strong brand, a global brand that's recognized, understand that if you were to go into a public talent pool scenario, your brand might be attracting talent to your talent community that's intended for your brand because of the strength of that brand, but it's possible some other organization is able to capitalize off of that or benefit from your brand strength. And you may say, you know what, that's great because I'm helping the overall, talent community find work, and that's admirable. But you may say, I want to build a talent asset for my organization. I want that talent asset to be exclusive to my hiring managers, in which case you may have a different decision process. So again, I'm not saying one's right or wrong. There's arguments on both sides. It's something that you need to consider and understand. The fourth one that I would look at is system integrations. So you've heard about that a little bit, probably in previous sessions and then again earlier today. I would say you can find plenty of examples of non-integrated programs that are quite successful. But just like any technology, the more integrated it can be with other workflows and other processes you have, the more efficient, the more intuitive, and the better experience that it typically creates. Think about if you're a Salesforce user out there and you've got it integrated with your Outlook inbox, just how much more efficient that is. Could you operate in 2 separate platforms? Of course you could, but it's a better experience having them integrated together. And then also our candidates are moving in that space, right? They don't necessarily want to have to be represented in an ATS, an FMS, a direct sourcing technology, and a VMS. And so is there a way to integrate these 2 things together and create a single view of that candidate across your organization? And there's ways to do that. So I would consider system integrations, implementation and change management competencies. So, Karen mentioned it already, there's not a heavy lift on your side as a client when it comes to implementation, but it's still something you need to think about with the provider, right? Do they have a track record of success of implementing a program? Do they have a strong practice around change management? Can they bring to you examples of how they'll drive that change within the organization, how they'll drive adoption of the program and to be able to achieve your goals? And so I would certainly look at that as a key criteria. And then the last one I'll touch on, because I've spoken quite a bit, I know I'm probably running out of my 3 to 4 minutes, is just curation, best practice, guidance, and experience, right? You're talking to technology providers, but we work with curators every single day. And so, as a criteria, are we able to help give that guidance and suggestions around experience for curation? Because the delivery mechanism of a direct sourcing program is critical to the success. And so you want to be considering that in your selection process. So I'll stop there and let somebody else chime in if they have additional comments.
Great answer, John. Appreciate it. Does anybody want to add anything?
I would just add, I think, we work with a lot of different types of companies. And I think, you always want to know, like, who have you worked with that kind of looks like me? But I think it's almost more important to understand how robust is the technology? What are the capabilities? What are the lessons learned? We have more than 150 clients globally. And so if somebody comes to me and says, do you have another client that looks exactly like me? I may or may not, but I can share with you the best practices and the things that you share, regardless of the industry that you might be in. And so I think it's just, you need to consider how robust the technology, what does the candidate experience look like? Certainly compliance is important, but I think about those things in kind of a different way. So you want to make sure you have a robust solution. The candidate experience is great. What are the lessons learned? What are the best practices? And how much experience does that company have across various sectors and potentially various geographies?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Karen. Appreciate
Brian,
that.
the piece I'll probably agree with everything John and Karen have put out there. One of the other things we see is really the customers and prospects really reviewing the embedded AI that's making most of that happen, right? That's driving that candidate experience, that's driving that match accuracy, that's driving those recommendation engines, and certainly would put that on the list of things for companies to look at as they're going through an evaluation process.
Good point, Coop. Thank you. We have a question, Coop. Stay active here with us for a second. What questions should I ask providers when I'm checking, or I'm sorry, I'm reading this wrong. What questions should I ask when checking a provider's references?
Yeah, it's a lot of things, but I think I would first want to start with, what was that customers, or what was that references value drivers? What were they trying to accomplish? Because as I articulated earlier, one of my answers in terms of which provider is going to be best for you to engage, a lot of that is use case attribute oriented, right? What are you trying to solve for? Because that naturally may lead you, to one of us 4 providers here on the call. But first, understand what were they trying to accomplish, because that will help align what you hear through the remainder of that question. Beyond understanding what were trying to accomplish, what were the lessons learned? What were the things that they went through that you can leverage in your direct sourcing deployment? Additionally, from there, how did they deploy? Did they do a land and expand type of scenario where a certain scope was chosen, accomplishment was achieved, and they broadened the direct sourcing solution beyond the initial entry point? I'd want to understand that. I would ask them their success metrics. that they have seen through the direct sourcing program, right? Are they seeing an improvement in submittal times? Are they seeing an improvement in hiring accuracy? Are they seeing an improvement in candidate retention, hiring manager satisfaction, talent cloud populations, et cetera? I would want to know those success metrics that are tied to what they have seen. Another thing I'd want to look at is the launch timelines to success. Right, we talk a lot in our industry about public and private marketplaces, right? And to John's point, they work. Some of them work individually, some of them work together. But understanding if they, whichever one they had, or if they had both, what successes did they see day one? Right, when you do roll out a public marketplace, you're going live day one with an embedded, curated talent community. How did that scale? And then secondly, if you went live with private as well, or just private individually, what was the ramp period to achieve that success? So I want to understand, the ramp of both of those, the hiring manager feedback as well as any candidate experience metrics that you're able to capture. But I think, all those really resonate as to the success they've had within the program. But again, I would circle back most importantly to what were they trying to accomplish? Did they accomplish it? To make sure that's aligned with either what you're trying to do as the one checking the reference, or maybe you learned something you would do differently.
Great answer. And, I'm just thinking out loud here, but adding to what you're saying, it probably makes sense to check more mature programs too, right? So you want to probably talk to references for programs that have been stood up for maybe a year or more, unless you're particularly focused on implementation in that experience. But I think maybe there's some emphasis on program maturity, folks who've seen more, maybe dealt with more. I'm, just thinking out loud. What are your thoughts on that?
So you're asking me specific or the broader panelists?
Oh, just broader panels. Fine.
Okay. So, okay.
I think that I was going to say, I like that idea, Brian. I think it's important to understand when you're asking those questions, what was that client's expectation in terms of what success looked like? Did they follow kind of the best practices that we've all talked about? And did they allow use of brand? Was there any period of exclusivity? Like there are things that will make a direct sourcing program more successful or not. And so depending on whether they follow those best practices may have a direct impact on the ability to scale that program that may be not the fault of the curator or the technology company or the technology partner. So I think it's important to understand the dynamics of that program, how it was set up, what the expectations were in terms of success, and kind of where they stand today, bumping up against those metrics.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Praneeth, you wanted to add something, I think?
Yeah, I was going to say that each organization's direct sourcing journey is unique in its nature, based on, size of the program, based on the nature of categories that you're working, whether it's light industrial, healthcare, IT, or something else, by region, and based on also how is your organization responding from an internal buyer stakeholders? What is the response time or engagement time? Do they need very heavy hand holding, or are they more of a self-service category of hiring managers? These all components differ, and taking an example of a reference is great from talking to people, but try to learn the journey, try to learn, like Karen said, dynamics around what made that happen. Try to understand what made that happen and tailor that and see and match it against your program. That's super important because we're still in an early stages of direct sourcing, right? As an industry and together. So it's important for us to go through that education process, keep that open mind, and have a bit of iterative approach in your own program to go through that, because somebody who has done in light industrial probably know better on how to execute that. So having that reference specifically could be a challenge in achieving from any providers in the market. Right.
No, thanks for the commentary. I appreciate it. Praneeth, let's keep you on the hot seat here. I've got a question for you. What are the pros and cons of starting with a pilot direct sourcing program?
Wow. I burned my hands there a couple of times. So, I think pilot is fairly used because this is such a new term, a new adoption, new process. Like early on, how when you look back how MSPs and VMS journey went through, this is the same journey, but not as much lengthier long, because everybody is much more matured and there is a familiarity with talent acquisition process. The problem with pilot as a word is, if you term the pilot to be very small, which means sometimes you'll say, let me focus on this particular jobs, let me focus on this particular skill set only in this particular region. Now, too many factors form that particular criteria, right? For an example, if you're measuring a particular program success or technology success or a curator success without feeding any of your alumni talent, because you said, maybe after the pilot, I'll lead this data into this pilot. I won't give you any data. I won't support any of the brand or anything. Your pilot has it's fairly handicapped, so you can't measure anything much out of it. Second, a couple of jobs, some instances where we're saying, hey, here is a list of really urgent jobs I want to fill. Let me bring you in because I'll get an internal buying very quickly to try something different. This is not about trying something different. This is a long-term talent acquisition strategy of a contingent labor. If you see this as a short-term and let me solve one type of problem through a pilot, not only you'll waste everybody's time, but you'll waste your own time because you'll be frustrated not seeing the results from it, because it will take time for a direct sourcing talent pool, the program, the maturity of this process to come around. So pilot is difficult. But where can you pilot? For an example, you have 300 sites or 400 sites. Going live in all these 300 sites at once, it's extremely challenging. And in fact, to get that buying across that a larger organization like those sites would be much more difficult. So how do you achieve that? Well, you break it down into more of high volume, give enough volume into the program, give enough criteria, design criteria, what will make this successful? Do we have enough time? And also, do we have enough volume of jobs? Do we have enough attributes like the talent from your internal talent, from your external traction talent, all the criteria which are defined or designed working with your provider to make, here are the key success criteria. Without this, we cannot work. And without this much of volume in this location, we cannot work. And this is the ramp up time for the talent pool build. Then consider this and run a pilot. In our mind, pilot is like 60, 90 days. No, it depends on your program and the criteria of how you do it.
What would you say the average time for a pilot is when it does happen?
So the readiness of a customer totally depends on it, right? You would not consider your preparation into a pilot timeline. And if the program, you create a key milestones of an indicator within your pilot, where you say, is the site live, branding approved, branding is live, the talent pool data is loaded from a predefined known talent, your traction channels are fully identified and a basic experimentation is done, the messaging is fully complete and ready to go when you're doing an internal launch, the referral programs, if you are considering that to launch, everything is ready. When everything is ready, give about at least 90 days to operate that. If you operate that in a 90-day cycle, you'll start seeing enough KPIs. These many jobs, this is my time to fill, this is my time to first submittal, or several KPIs which are fairly available in most of the technology platforms, or at least a combination of that you can derive from VMS, from your activity, and from the DS technology or curation metrics. That will make sure you have everything ready and then roll out a pilot. The big mistakes I have seen is like a lot of the scope of kickstarting things kind of roll into the pilot timeline, and then you get like 10 days, 30 days to measure everything within the activity. And this is all new. So everybody's initially in a chaotic mode a little bit before it kind of goes into stability. So give as much time and learn if it is not successful in the 90 days, what did not work and what worked. There are some attributes which worked, which did not work. So if you find that collaborative dialogue saying this did not work, how do we make this work? Does it mean that this will never work for us? And this worked items or attributes which worked, can I double down and see how I can increase the traction and engagement and success in DS? And that journey is important. So it could be that first 90 and then later.
No, I appreciate the detail. It's a good answer, kind of a tough question. Karen, I have one for you. what does typical direct sourcing pricing look like? And I realize direct sourcing is kind of a catch-all word. So, if you look at it from the perspective of curation and maybe from the perspective of technology, just curious to get your comments on what does pricing look like? What are the different models that are out there?
Yeah, so I think there's performance-based models where it's a percentage of pay rate that either the technology or the curation may charge. I think when you're talking EOR, it's typically a markup on pay rate. So, ideally, when you're choosing your partner, you will get one rate that will cover EOR, technology, and curation. But I think when you break that down, and I'll speak more from a technology perspective, it's typically a percentage of pay rate, not bill rate. So that's an important distinction. It's pay for performance. So typically the partner gets paid once a placement's been made from the talent pool. There's also subscription-based models out there where it may be a monthly or a yearly subscription. I think some other things to consider are there may be a monthly minimum requirement, depending on which partners you choose. They need to make sure that they can recoup their costs for recruiting, for the technology, et cetera, implementation. Some may charge an implementation fee. I think these are all questions that you need to ask your partners as you're making those decisions about who you want to ultimately choose. But I think it can sound complex, but I think even when you add up those fees, it will oftentimes be less than what you're being charged by a traditional staffing provider. Cost savings is certainly, or I would say it's typically a result of implementing a direct sourcing solution, but it may not be your key driver. I've talked to clients where their key driver is really quality and efficiency and driving outcomes. And so if you have a highly leveraged supply base, you may not see the cost savings that maybe other programs will see, but typically it will be less than your traditional staffing supplier. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that helps a little bit, and certainly my colleagues can add in.
I think it was a great answer. Just to do a quick time check, we're down to about 9 minutes here, and I'm hoping we could take, I see 3 more questions. Let's go ahead and roll and see if we can cover a few more here. So Coop, this question's for you. What are best practices to ensure successful collaboration among our technology, curation, and payroll partners?
Yep, and I think a great thing to recognize is that the 4 of us are all tech company providers, but you've heard all 4 of us say curation, right? You've heard all 4 of us talk about an employer of record or payrolling. In my view, and probably my co-panelist view, direct sourcing, it is a 3-pronged solution that takes direct sourcing technology, which the 4 of us provide, partners with human curation, and also partners with payrolling providers, for all the risk compliance, employee benefit, candidate experience, et cetera. So all 3 are really the core components of a direct sourcing solution. So I'd say 1, you need all 3. I would say secondly, each part is critical. I would say, don't diminish one over the other. I think there's simplicity in one. If you look at payrolling, that's tied to candidate experience. That's very critical because we all talk about candidate experience. I would say integration between those 3 solutions is key to speed. It's key to candidate experience. I think from a tech provider perspective, you would see each of our abilities to best enable that curator to do their job and best enable that curator to pick up that part of the sourcing process and execute that to fruition. Mm-hmm. And I think you would see differing strategies where some companies may be able to provide all 3 of those under one corporate umbrella. Some are partnered, but I would say in some, it's critical that you have all 3 as a component of your direct sourcing solution. I'll stop there in recognition of time, but really that would sum up that piece, Brian.
Would you guys all agree that typically the curation provider is taking the lead when it comes to rolling out a program and ensuring collaboration, communication, training, change management? I'm sure there are programs where maybe there's not third-party curation. Maybe some folks run in-house or they run through an MSP, but is it fair to say that Curation is more or less leading the initiative?
Not necessarily, no. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I think it's a collaborative thing, right? Because the curation is going to pick up where we as the tech providers are done with our tech piece. So I think it's very collaborative to understand. I mean, if you're looking, we give big, sports analogies, right? A lot. If we're looking at a 9-inning game and we're looking at the curator to pick up in that 8th inning, there's got to be coordination between what did we as the tech providers do in those 8 innings that best enables that curation to come in as the relief pitcher and close out the process. So I would say it's much more collaborative than driven by one or the other.
Okay, good to know.
And I do think it's important for the curation and technology and EOR to outline roles and responsibilities. So that everybody understands who's doing what, who's responsible for what, and who, once it's implemented, who is going to be that point of contact, whether it's the MSP or the curation partner, but just to make sure everybody understands the handoffs and what's involved and who's responsible for what.
Great. So essentially a RACI for implementation and change management. Yep, makes perfect sense. Let's see if we can get 2 more questions in. So Praneeth, for you, how can I ensure the performance of my providers?
It's a pretty long answer. So there's no short answer, but some best practices from a process point of view. I think the RACI sheet and that bifurcation is super important because it gets confusing to classify how to measure them. But once you understand how to measure what, building KPIs, most of the providers in technology do have reporting capabilities today to measure this. And what you're doing is you're extending your MSP or supplier performance metrics and then adopting, because some key additional metrics that you measure your providers on are going to be, which never existed. For an example, the traffic enablement, the organic versus inorganic traffic. How much are you generating? Are you generating it or not? And what is your apply ratio, which means view to apply ratio? And how is your conversion ratio of an applicants? Or what is an engagement ratio through your matching engine or the AI matching capabilities, your email open rates, your response rates on any of this? But then on top of that, you have the first submittal. How fast did you submit? What is the quality of the submission? Submit to interview, submit to hire, submit to shortlist. Any of those ratios are important to measure. And initially, if you don't have that KPIs, look at least activity behind it. And most of that could be the curation activity primarily to do that. So pretty much pretty long list of things that you can measure each provider on. Even for EOR services, because there is a handoff, there has to be best practices and a handshake rules established. So how is that handshake happening? And doing some kind of an NPS score or interviews with the candidate through the first journey of the process to understand what is the candidate experience from the first touch all the way to onboarding into your organization, including your assets allocation. So if that process is fully measured out, which is ultimately you deliver the best of candidate experience. If you see any compromises on the candidate experience through this journey, you might want to correct it in an early phase so that you can keep a KPI like that to repeatedly measure that on a quarterly basis.
Good, great, insightful answer. So it sounds like you're adding some search engine optimization sort of metrics around traditional sourcing and staffing metrics. It's very insightful. Thank you, Praneeth. Appreciate it. John, we got 2 minutes. Got a question for you. Bring us home here. Should I be concerned about compliance standards such as SOC and GDPR?
Yes. Back to you, Brian. No, to expand on that. Yeah, I mean, the short, simple answer is yes, I think you should be. We're all technology providers. We're dealing with personal information. SOC, I'll add another one, ISO and GDPR. These are all industry standards. So absolutely, I think you should be considering these in your selection process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the definitions of each of these, but for people that don't know, I mean, SOC 2, Type 2 reporting or auditing is around internal controls for safeguards with company data and customer and candidate data. ISO is an international standard around how to manage information security, and GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulations, They say themselves that they're the toughest laws in the world, data privacy laws in the world. And a key word there is laws, right? These aren't suggestions. And so these are laws that carry hefty fines if you violate them. And so absolutely, I think that these should be a concern or a consideration. Now, the better question might be why you should be thinking about these, and I'll be fast on them, but I'm going to give you guys a couple statistics here that I think will help. First one is from the Identity Theft Resource Center 2021. They determined that in North America, so this I'm not taking a global view at the moment, that there were 1,862 corporate breaches in 2021. So think about that in terms of a day. That's about 5 to 6 corporate breaches every single day. So while we're sitting here, some company is being breached. And that affected about 300 million people in the United States or in North America last year. So, I mean, that's one number just to think about, is just the sheer magnitude of what's happening out there from a data security and breach standpoint. The second one is from the Ponemon Institute in 2020, which is the cost of a data breach. They run studies on how much it actually costs organizations when there is a data breach. And what they've found is that it's about $3.8 million on average when you look worldwide, but in the United States, it's about $8.65 million for a data breach. And if you're trying to think, well, how does that actually happen? Take customer personal information, which averages about $175 per breached record. And then let's say you had 50,000 candidates in your database. That's $8.75 million in cost based on a data breach of just 50,000 candidates, which actually isn't that many. So I think it's something that we should all be thinking about. We should all be considering. And then in addition to the financial cost, I'll give you a list real quick: reputational damage, operational downtime, legal action, loss of sensitive data, and organizational competence are all impacted from data breaches. So I would absolutely consider a provider's certifications and capabilities when it comes to data privacy and information security.
Excellent answer, and appreciate the data points there too. We are up on our 1 hour time. I want to say thank you to our panelists. It's been an excellent webinar, very informative. Thank you for joining us again. For our audience, thank you for spending part of your day with us here. I do want to mention that the Direct Sourcing Forum is a quarterly webinar. We're going to meet again on Tuesday, July 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So please save the date. We look forward to seeing you there. Wish everybody a great day. Thanks for your time.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone.